Good evening. It's good to see all of you, and thank you for coming out to the 92nd Street Y. I'm David Gergen, and I'm here to represent not only the 92nd Street Y, but the Center for Public Leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School, where I'm privileged to teach. You know, if you think back about it, in politics, one of the most sensitive barometers that politicians watch about the state of the nation's mental health is the question, is the country on the right track or the wrong track? Historically, we've been on the right track. In an unprecedented series of numbers for the past 10 years, we have consistently been seen by the public as on the wrong track. Americans have lost a lot of faith in the future. And tonight, I think you'll leave here encouraged about the future. Because tonight we're going to showcase some of the rising stars of the coming generations. People who hold enormous promise for the country, who, as you will hear, have approached their lives with passion. They're creative, they're innovative. The spirit of innovation may be in our DNA as a nation. It may be one of the saving graces of the country. But rather than hearing from me, let's go to the stars of the show. I'll introduce each one as we go. Let them ask each person to sort of tell his story, her story, and then we'll turn to some general questions and we'll welcome your questions. So let's get started with Jared Cohen, who is immediately to my left. Jared graduated from college 9 years ago. Stanford, Rhodes Scholar after that. So he's been out essentially for 7 years. And he's already president of Google Ideas. He's co-written a book with Eric Schmidt about the future of technology and the world. And Time Magazine named him as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. 7 years since leaving school. Jared, tell us a little bit about your story.
Thanks for making it very awkward. Well, since you are making me reflect back 9 years, I think about when I first arrived at Stanford, and I was obsessed with Margaret Mead, who some of you may know, some of you may not. She was a very famous anthropologist, and I basically wanted to be her. And I wanted to travel to different parts of sub-Saharan Africa, learn the languages, spend time in different communities. And so I spent my entire first year at Stanford basically begging every different center and academic branch of the university to send me to East Africa to do my first groundbreaking research. And I basically formulated a hypothesis that was quite obvious, where the research wasn't very interesting, but I had a wonderful 3 months living in this Maasai village and herding goats and sheep and sort of going to ceremonies and so forth, but it got boring very, very quickly, and I realized I didn't want to be an anthropologist. And so there was my first year of Stanford. After 3 months of doing this, I wanted to go see the mountain gorillas in Uganda. So I left Kenya, I went to Uganda, and the gorillas were very popular, so I couldn't get a permit. So I went to Rwanda. And all I knew about Rwanda was the genocide hadn't happened that long ago, kind of a rough place, but the gorillas were there. So I get there, and all anybody obviously can do is talk about the genocide, and immediately the gorillas become a side activity, and I start asking people questions about, you know, how this happened, why this happened, tell me your story. And the more time I spent in Rwanda, the more upset I became that I wasn't taught about this horrific moment in history where 800,000 people were killed in the span of 100 days in the spring of 1994. I eventually did see the gorillas, but I made it back into western Uganda, and I realized I was only 16 kilometers from the Congolese border. And for some reason growing up, I was just always fixated with the Congo. I have no idea why. And I went up to the border and found that it was closed because of an ongoing conflict between the Congo, Uganda, and Rwanda. But there was a nice caveat to this, which is if you were involved in banana commerce between any of those countries, they let you cross. So I met a wonderful guy who I spent time with him and his family the night before, who was involved in banana commerce. And he snuck me across the border, and I hung out in eastern Congo for a little bit. It was basically a day trip. Came back, flew back to the United States, and went out all night with my friends in New York, because that's what you do. And whenever we left wherever we were at a diner downtown at about 5 in the morning, and we're standing in front of the Twin Towers, and my friend says, wow, it must be really weird to, in the last 72 hours, have been in Rwanda where a genocide happened, Congo, which is in the midst of a civil war where all the perpetrators of the genocide lived, and having come off the heels of 3 months of herding goats. And I said, yes, it's strange. And we sort of speculated, how many people do you think work in the buildings and so forth. Anyway, to put it in context, it was about 5:30 in the morning, September 11th, 2001. So I have a photograph with 3 of my friends from Stanford in front of the Twin Towers, literally hours before it went down. I eventually went back to Connecticut for a dentist appointment and found out about what happened while my mom and I were pulling out of the driveway. I tell you that story for a couple reasons. It highlights several themes. One, as a young person, you follow what you're curious, you follow what the direction your curiosity takes you in, but events happen, experiences unfold, and it throws your whole course upside down. And how do you go through such a drastic set of events in such a short period of time and not want to serve, not want to figure out the root causes of what happened? And so much of my life starts with that 72-hour period where everything that I thought I was interested in just sort of collided, turned upside down, and set me on a path that I'm on today.
All right. Take us then to your Persian expedition as you went to Iran.
So I basically became obsessed with traveling and looking at U.S. foreign policy in Africa while I was at Stanford. So I kept just going several times a year and, again, begging more departments and centers to give me money. And not that many people were traveling to Africa at that time, so it was actually quite easy to get the money. And a number of my professors were worried I was putting myself in dangerous situations. So they did an intervention, I think it's called. One of my professors, he actually was a professor of political science, but he said he was very good at statistics. And he asked me if I had any background in probability and statistics, and I said no, and it didn't really interest me. And he said, if you could indulge me for a moment, let me give you your chance of survival if you keep doing this, and I think it was like 13%. When I went to Oxford, I basically looked at a map and said, what's a part of the world that I want to learn more about? I'm sort of going to take a break from Africa. And the Islamic Republic of Iran seemed like a good place for a Jewish kid from Connecticut to spend some time. And so I went there in 2004 and went there to interview opposition figures and dissidents and uncovered a youth demographic that was far more interesting and far more illustrative of what a real opposition is.
Because?
So I was never interested in technology until I went to Iran, which is also sort of strange, but in order to understand how I ended up with a geopolitical background now working at Google, I guess it's an interesting and useful story. I remember being in some of the marketplaces in various cities and watching these young people use technology that I thought I understood in ways that you could never possibly imagine. So my favorite story to tell is how these young Iranians were using Bluetooth not to talk and drive, but to call and text complete strangers because they couldn't just go up to them, obviously because of heavy restrictions in the country. And what you realize is the tools and the technology may still be built in the developed world by big companies and well-trained engineers, but if you really want to figure out how to use your mobile device, you have to go to a place that is just ridden with problems. Poverty, repression, heavy restrictions, et cetera, because necessity drives innovation. And you saw that in Iran as early as 2004. And so these young people were using technology primarily to socially indulge and flirt and so forth. But these tools of flirtation and social indulgences, if you fast forward to 2009, became the primary and go-to resource for civic activism. And so you saw this in 2004 and 2005, and I left Iran with a profound belief that this nexus between geopolitics and technology was going to be the defining discipline that would explain everything that was going to happen in the next several decades, and I still fundamentally believe that. And to the theme of this session this evening, I think that's why I'm so optimistic about the next generation. Who's better able and equipped to understand that than a generation that is traveling more than any other generation, a generation that from start to finish has been brought up with technology, and a generation that is hungry for sort of new opportunities in the workplace? I'd say it's a pretty good time to be graduating from a university because the comparative—
Even if you can't get a job?
Well, people will tell a young person they can't get a job because the economy is bad and so forth. My response to somebody graduating from a university is your knowledge of technology is your comparative advantage. And so I always say you'll know more, whatever job you land in, you're likely to know more about technology than whoever you work for. And if you don't take advantage of that, and if you don't treat that as your comparative advantage, it's a missed opportunity. And it doesn't matter. It literally could be any field. It does not matter.
How many people in the world use iPhones now, mobile devices?
A lot use Android devices.
Or Android devices. How many are on the internet now?
So you have 2.4 billion, and the numbers are actually pretty astounding. You have 2.4 billion people who are online today. If you go back to the year 2000, you had 361 million people connected to the internet. That's an extraordinary jump. You'll have another 5 billion connected in the next decade.
How will that change things?
Well, if you think about where these 5 billion people are coming online, they're coming online in countries that have autocratic governments, that are unstable, that have ethnic and religious divisions, that are extremely poor, ridden with challenges. And so the next 5 billion will look very different than the first 2.4 billion. And what's interesting is that in some respects there is a symbiotic relationship between those two, the current internet community and the future internet community, in the sense that, as I mentioned before, the devices may be exported to the developing world, but the use cases will be sent right back to the rest of us.
Wow, 7 years. 7 years since leaving school. It's remarkable. Let's keep moving. We could talk, the two of us could talk all night, but you would miss out on two other major figures here. Probably 10 years ago, Cheryl and I were talking about this. 10 years ago, if you told someone you're a social entrepreneur, they'd have a puzzled look on their face, not really know quite what you were talking about. That has changed dramatically, and now the social entrepreneurship movement is really sweeping American campuses, and a growing number of young people are signing up in one way or another. I have, in the past, thought this movement looks more like the civil rights movement than anything we've seen in the intervening years. It's extraordinarily interesting because these people are almost to a person dedicated to improving the common good, not necessarily by going into government, that's a question we'd like to come back to, but by working in nonprofits and for-profits. At the center of that movement, the person carrying the banner that so many other young people have followed in the years since has been Cheryl Dorsey. She's here in New York. She runs an organization called Echoing Green. Let her tell you about it. Cheryl, just know this. She has 3 degrees from Harvard. Is that enough? She's a college, the medical school, and the Kennedy School. Cheryl Dorsey.
Thank you, David. Good evening. I clearly am not one of the young people here like Jared and Jack, but I have the good fortune every day working with extraordinary young people like them from around the world. So as David mentioned, I run an organization called Echoing Green. Echoing Green was actually founded 25 years ago by the senior leadership of a private equity firm called General Atlantic. And as best I can tell, it was the second or third earliest founded social entrepreneurship organization. And it was a really beautiful, elegant, and optimistic vision set out by the General Atlantic folks, that if you sort of invested in young people, invested in young people who had innovative, sometimes crazy ideas for making their communities better, and you did it in ways that applied business principles and practices, you could actually spark significant positive social change. So they set out to do that. So essentially, Echoing Green is the world's leading angel investor in young social entrepreneurs. So every year, we open up our doors and ask for submissions from all around the world, asking young people, what problems are you seeing in your community, and what are the innovative solutions that you are proposing? So just a month ago, we received close to 3,000 submissions from over 100 countries around the world. And the breadth is just extraordinary. From a young man who lost his parents to AIDS and who at the age of 7 was responsible for his 5 younger siblings, but somehow managed to get into a school in Uganda and somehow managed to get himself to Berkeley, where he got his degree in mechanical engineering, and now has gone back to start a social enterprise that provides transport solutions for patients and children in rural Uganda. Or it's people like Kennedy Odede, who, as best I can tell, is the first person ever to graduate from a 4-year university coming out of Kibera, which is Africa's largest slum. Kennedy now runs an organization called Shining Hope for Communities, which is a grassroots organization that last year alone served 40,000 people in Kibera and has already quickly become one of the largest employers in that slum. So imagine this kind of collective action amongst young people. It really is a global movement, as David has said. And the fact that when you poll young people on college campuses, 81% said they are deeply committed to making their communities better, which is an extraordinary pipeline for the social entrepreneurship movement. So again, I'm not at all jaded or cynical or concerned about our future, because I see thousands and thousands of young people each and every year who are committing their intellectual capital, their social capital, their time and talent to taking on and hopefully solving some of our society's greatest challenges.
Tell us, if you would, Cheryl, about the role of Echoing Green and social entrepreneurs here in New York City.
Sure. We, over the years, have funded a great number of extraordinary young innovators who are working to make this city better. So if you all ride the subways and you've seen the cool ads for Freelancers Union, one of our favorite Echoing Green fellows, Sarah Horowitz, a labor lawyer. She was the daughter of a labor lawyer, the granddaughter of a labor lawyer, who recognized about 15 years ago that our changing workforce no longer could benefit from sort of the social safety net that tracked your healthcare benefits with your employer. With a third of today's workforce being part-time, contingent, or contractual, that system that came out of FDR's age no longer fit the way we do our work today. So she created something called Freelancers Union, which I think as of today is now the 7th largest union in New York alone, and has actually been working with the Obama administration to set up one of the healthcare exchanges in New York and New Jersey and Portland, Oregon, I believe.
It's really interesting.
Absolutely.
And where do you see this movement 5 to 10 years from now? Jared was talking about the number of people are going to be coming online. What do you see happening with social entrepreneurship?
I think there are a couple of things. You know, social entrepreneurship as a movement is really quite young. I mean, the field is only about 30 years old. And it's interesting, if you had done a Nexus search for the term social entrepreneurship in the year 2000 or 2001, there may have been 350 stories or titles that you would have come across. If you had done that same search a year ago, you would have seen closer to 4,000, 5,000 stories. So this really has penetrated the popular consciousness. And I think this is a movement that is here to stay, number one, because you have young people like Jared and Jack who have come online during an age of technology where they are global citizens of the highest order in a way that my generation was not. I think they have gotten a bird's eye view to some of the tough challenges that are facing us locally as well as globally, and armed with technology and access to top flight educations are recognizing that they actually have a really important role to play in being society's change agents. So I also think that we have a golden moment where you've got a lot of young people who are really dissatisfied with the current institutions, and they don't necessarily trust them or respect them in the way that our generation did. But instead of sort of turning their back completely on these institutions, they are hard at work trying to innovate and make these institutions better. So I actually think we have a real moment here to train this new pipeline, this new generation of talent to actually work within the system to make it better.
Great. Yeah. Good. Innovation. Innovation. It can come at a pretty early age. It can come at a pretty early age. You may wonder how this young man, what he's doing up here on this stage, you know, right? Doesn't have a tie on. He's about, I'd say, a fair degree younger than most of us up here. In fact, he and I, we may reverse numbers on our age. I'm not sure. Jack Andraka came up here tonight, or this afternoon, from Baltimore. But tell us about your journey before you got on the train.
So essentially, my story really began when I was 13, and what happened is a close family friend who's like an uncle to me actually passed of a disease called pancreatic cancer. And when the disease hit so close to home, I really knew I needed to learn more. So I went online and using Google, I found a variety of statistics on the disease, and what I had found really shocked me. Over 85% of all of these cancers are diagnosed late, when some has less than a 2% chance of survival. And the current method for detecting cancer is the 60-year-old technique. I mean, that's older than my dad. But also, it costs $800 per test and is grossly inaccurate, missing 30% of all cancers. So I set out.
30% of all cancers?
Yeah, 30% of all pancreatic cancers it misses.
Okay.
And it's rarely ordered, actually. It's only ordered if you have a familial history of the cancer. And so armed with freshman biology, I decided to go out and try and revolutionize cancer diagnostics, a bit lofty of a goal.
How old were you?
I was 14 at the time.
14, okay. Launching a revolution, all right.
But I was going to do it. And so going back to any high schooler's best friends for information, Google and Wikipedia, how I got through every high school test and quiz, I essentially came up with all these different research, and I found this one cancer biomarker called mesothelin. And mesothelin is just your ordinary run-of-the-mill type protein, unless you have pancreatic, ovarian, and lung cancer, in which case it's found at these very high levels in your bloodstream, but also it's found the earliest stage when you have close to 100% chance of survival. So then I had this one epiphany moment on this large, epic journey I had embarked on. And it came in my high school biology class, which is an absolute stifler of innovation, particularly with my high school biology teacher. We did not get along. And so I rebelled how any high schooler would by sneaking in a scientific article from Science on what are called carbon nanotubes. And these are long, thin tubes of carbon that are an atom thick, and they're 1/50,000th the diameter of your hair. So extremely small, and they have these very incredible properties. They're like the superheroes of material science. And then we were learning about these things called antibodies, which are molecules that only react with one specific protein, in this case, the cancer biomarker mesothelin. I was just sitting there, and all of a sudden I put two and two together and thought maybe I could add the specificity of these antibodies to the amazing properties of carbon nanotubes and make a cool sensor. And actually, it's about as simple as making chocolate chip cookies to make the sensor that I produced. And you start with some water, you pour in some nanotubes, add some antibodies, mix it up, take some paper, dip it, dry it, and then you can detect cancer. It's a bit more complicated than that, but you get the gist. It's actually very simple to make. And however, I realized I'm going to need a lab. I couldn't do this on my kitchen countertop. We had done some pretty crazy stuff, me and my brother. We made high-powered explosives in our basement. We also cultured E. coli and cholera where we make sandwiches. We even got uranium and have this giant vat sitting in our basement that landed us on the FBI watch list. But I mean, it was only $160. It was on sale for 50% off. You can't blame me. So eventually, I emailed 200 different labs at Johns Hopkins University and the National Institutes of Health, and it was pretty much anyone that had anything to do with pancreatic cancer. And I expected to get all of these positive emails, but I got 199 rejections. And I realized a lot of professors aren't nearly as nice as those glowing profile pictures make them seem. They actually can be very mean sometimes and rip apart your procedure, unlike your parents, who say everything is amazing. However, eventually, one professor, Dr. Anirban Mehitra at Johns Hopkins University, finally accepted me into his lab, and after a grueling 1-hour interview with him and several PhDs, I finally got the lab space I needed, and 7 months later, I ended up with one small paper sensor that costs 3 cents and takes 5 minutes to run. So it's 168 times faster, over 26,000 times less expensive, and over 400 times more sensitive than our current methods of detection. But also, it can detect the cancer in the earliest stage, when something has close to 100% chance of survival. And so far, it has over 90% accuracy at detecting the cancer. So in the next 2 to 5 years, this patent-pending sensor could potentially lift the survival rates from 5.5% to close to 100%. And it would do similar for ovarian and lung cancer. But by switching out that antibody, you can detect an entirely different protein, meaning an entirely different disease. So you could detect diseases ranging from Alzheimer's to other forms of cancer, even HIV, AIDS, and heart disease, and even beyond that in environmental applications and other biomedical applications.
This is sort of America's version of a young Mozart. You know, it's extraordinarily interesting. So this essentially is a dipstick with treated with special solutions. And what do you do? I don't understand what you do with it.
So it's like a diabetic test strip. You just take a drop of blood or urine or saliva, and it will instantly tell you whether or not you have the cancer because it will change its electrical properties based on the amount of protein present. And I can actually measure this change with the $50 ohm meter I snagged from my dad.
So is it in widespread use now?
So currently I'm in talks with several large biotech companies, and we're talking about getting on clinical trials, but it's going to be 5 to 10 years before it reaches market, simply because you need to test like 25,000 pancreatic cancer samples to get through the FDA. And the problem with pancreatic cancer samples is that it's not a very common cancer, and you have to work cross-institution, and that takes a lot of money.
Well, you have competed with 1,500 other young scientists for the Intel Prize, for the Gordon Moore Prize, a $75,000 prize, right?
Yes.
And you won.
I actually did win it, and 6 other special awards, so it totaled for $100,000, which was really surprising because I was in 9th grade and I was super nervous, and I wasn't expecting any awards. I was just, so of course, if you've seen the YouTube video, it's me screaming my head off running up and crying in hysterics. It was quite the experience.
Yeah, so now have you formed a company?
So I do have an LLC, and currently I'm also working on the Nokia Biosensing X Prize for $2.25 million, and I'm submitting a different technology for that. And then also I'm working with my friend from my school on making sustainable filters out of plastic water bottles for filtration of heavy metals and pesticides from water.
And so for the pancreatic cancer detection system, do you have a patent on that?
Yeah, so I do have an international patent on the technology.
So you do. You're secure in that.
Yes.
Now it's a question of going through the trials, but the early indications are that obviously that it works.
Yes, yeah, it looks very promising for detection of pancreatic cancer, and also it can hopefully monitor your response to chemotherapy regimens, as well as tell you whether or not your surgery was a success, whether or not your cancer is in remission or recurring.
So Jack, are you going to skip college?
So I actually have been getting frantic emails from the Teal Fellowship people, and I've decided not to do that, but they keep sending me emails, unfortunately. So I've kind of moved that into spam folder. But I do want to go. I do want to go to college just because, I mean, you're never going to have that opportunity to be around peers of your own age who are also really amazingly intelligent.
Yeah, Harvard is very interested in talking to you, actually.
I'm, of course, interested in talking to Harvard.
Well, that's good. I've already met one gentleman tonight said if you'd go to Harvard, he'd supply the scholarship.
That's great.
And so, what do you want to do when you grow up?
I just took my SATs, so I still have to get those back. But who knows? Maybe I'll just get an English major and write books and poetry.
So you've done a TED Talk.
Yes.
Were you the youngest ever to do a TED Talk?
No, but I might be the one to do the most frequent. I've done 17 now. Wow.
You've done 17 TED Talks?
Yes, so I did one at Main Stage and then 16 TEDx's.
Oh my goodness.
So.
That may be the most ever. Is that one for every year of your life? Is that right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. They're like birthday presents.
Okay, good. Terrific. Well, join in this conversation now, Jack, because I want to go back to Jared and ask him about service. You spent 4 years in government. You were very close to and working in the State Department and policy planning, I believe, and you were very close to Secretary Rice, Condi Rice, and to Secretary Hillary Clinton. And I believe you were on the cover of the New York Times Sunday Magazine section, weren't you?
It was a nice article.
Yeah, right. Nice article. So you're the only one in the panel. Well, Cheryl, you were a White House fellow, but really you've spent more time in government. And is this generation of young leaders, many are steering away from government. Where do you think that's going to leave us over time?
No, this is a question I've thought a lot about lately. And before I answer, I do want to say it's very hard to not be optimistic about the future when you hear people like Jack. So I think that in some respects is our best illustration of why we should be optimistic. But turning back to your question, people often ask me why I left government and went into the private sector, and their assumption is that something happened, or I got disgruntled, or I felt beaten down by the bureaucracy. And it's quite the opposite. I had a fantastic experience in government. But a lot of the people that I talk to in my generation, right? They're altruistic, they're well-traveled, they want to change the world. They just don't want to do it by going into government. Mm-hmm. And this to me is a fundamental problem. We're a generation of builders, right? Everybody wants to go out and build a company. Everybody wants to go out and build a new technology. Everybody wants to build or create something, and that's how they want to have their impact. And if we're seeing a trend where talented young people don't want to serve in the public sector, then there's a real concern of who's actually going to lead us in the public sector. So the way that I try to capture this is none of us want to be led by the leftovers. And ultimately, that's what's going to happen if government service is so unappealing that people don't want to join it. Now, I also think that if you fast forward 10 years, I would hypothesize that we're going to start requiring our senior leadership of government to have some sort of experience or background in technology. So you think about cybersecurity today, it's such an important topic as it pertains to American defense. We're probably going to reach a point much sooner where the Secretary of Defense will be somebody who with a heavy background in cybersecurity, future Secretary of State, et cetera. But we do no recruiting at computer science departments. We do no recruiting at electrical engineering departments at universities. And we're entering into an era now in the aftermath of Bradley Manning, Julian Assange, Edward Snowden, where these sort of hacker cultures are finding going into government even less appealing as a result of those events. And so I'm very concerned about this because this is precisely the time where the United States needs people who are part of this tech generation to go into government, to want to serve. And there's probably no other moment in history that I can think of where that skill set will allow them to punch above their weight in a way that completely defies everything we know about bureaucracy.
Because you go in knowing more than the older generation.
You go in knowing more than the older generation. I'm a big believer in reverse mentorship as it pertains to technology. And so I think that for a young person going into government, they can very easily make themselves relevant regardless of what they could be working on US-China relations, they could be working on counter-narcotics, they could be working on the Israel-Palestinian issue. Literally, it doesn't matter what they're working on in government. There is a need to bring technology into that conversation, and they're the ones with the knowledge and the skill set. And I remember when I started in government in the Bush administration, there was a general rejection from most within the bureaucracy that technology was a fad, it was a phase that was going to go away. And I'll give both President Bush and Secretary Rice a lot of credit. In every single meeting that we had, both of them were probably the two most engaged people on this particular issue. In part, the notion of young people empowered with technology played into a lot of what they were thinking about with regards to the Freedom Agenda and others. And then if you think about the Obama administration, this was a president that owes a lot of thanks to social media as a campaign tactic. So they came in, bought into technology as a tactic, and then Hillary Clinton really elevated the issue of internet freedom and technology to be a central aspect of foreign policy. So all of this should create enormous demand for young people wanting to go serve, but that demand just is not there. In fact, the demand is on the government side.
So in many ways, you would argue to say in a city like New York, which has a finance industry, it has a fashion industry, it has an entertainment industry, that technology should not be seen as a separate industry. Rather, it's something that should influence all of the existing industries.
It's part of
heavily shaped.
We still silo technology out, regardless of what industry, right? And it started off as we siloed them out as the IT department,
right?
And then we siloed them into public diplomacy, or in the case of the banks, it's anti-money laundering and other things. And the reality is, it's not just about the technology skill set. One of the things that I've learned going from the State Department to Google is, there's a whole engineering culture that I'd never experienced before, and it's fascinating, it's important, it's missing in so many fields. There's a healthy disregard for things that are impossible. And when I sit with the engineers on my team, what's great is we're talking about geopolitics, and they'll throw out a bunch of suggestions that I would never think of because they're approaching problems like computer scientists. And then when we have a technical conversation, I'll suggest something that they would never think of because I'm approaching a technical problem like a political scientist. And the reality is you need both. If we believe that there's one world that has two fronts, a physical front and a digital front, and that these aren't two separate worlds, then you need engineers and you need non-engineers, and you need them working together. And a big role that I think this next generation can play is in translating between those two worlds, because it really is two different languages.
Yeah, that's interesting, because Cheryl, I went to a session here at the 92nd Street Y. It was a daytime luncheon. There at the Economic Development Corporation here in New York has a group of tech pioneers, they call them. There are 20 people who are in tech, but sort of doing startups and that sort of thing, and they come together for over a course of a year. And we brought in like 20 social entrepreneurs, and the conversation between them was a really, really interesting conversation, because just as you were saying, the social entrepreneurs come in with a language and a perspective, and it's all about the human relationships and the compassion and poverty questions. And the tech people would come in and say, well, I think we can solve the problem maybe this other way. It was an interesting, I'm just trying to figure out where social services will go from here in terms of drawing upon technology, and is that going to be an indispensable part of the 21st century leadership?
I think so, but I do think that one of the hallmarks of social entrepreneurship is the blurring of sectoral boundaries, right? So there's a real breakdown between the silos of government, of business, and the social sector,
Right.
because there's this increasing recognition that the critical challenges that we face really require the three sectors to work together, because each alone cannot sort of get to the level of scale to solve the problem. So I do think that is a hallmark of what we're seeing, and you're going to see young people like these who diffuse between industries, as opposed to me, who spent my entire career pretty much in the social sector. So I do think that diffusion, that osmosis bodes well for sort of getting leaders who are conversant across sectors. And in fact, I think there's some really interesting work being done. You know, McKinsey has been doing a lot of work over the past year talking about tri-sector athletes. So a new type of leader who is going to have experience across sector, and that's going to be required to build the kind of alliances and do the kind of engagement that we need to solve these very tough challenges. So I think there really is an opportunity for some of that cross-fertilization to happen.
Yeah. Good. On Jared's point about government service, I'm wondering to what extent, I've noticed a trend now, which I believe should be encouraged, of a growing number of social entrepreneurs running for office. They're turned off by the politics of today, but there are a growing number sort of jumping in. And so you have, or they're getting appointed to office. And so the state of Tennessee now has a Teach for America alum running their state superintendent. There was a big election in New Orleans that put John White in to run the public schools, a reformer in Louisiana. And you see that here in various communities, or Georgia now, where Michelle Nunn is running for the Senate. And she is a social entrepreneur and running for the United States Senate, and she's got a pretty good shot of winning. Or Colorado, where the young man was elected to the state legislature and changed the laws of the state on teacher evaluations in a very positive way. So do you think my hope is that politics will be changed by the younger generation. Do you see that? Do you think that's realistic?
I think so, and I mean, I think there's some examples within the Echoing Green community. Recently, an Echoing Green fellow, Mark Levine, was just elected to New York City Council. Mark started off as a TFA, Teach for America, core member, spent a number of years after his teaching experience actually working at Teach for America, and then went on to start Credit Where Credit Is Due, which was one of the first credit unions in Washington Heights serving low-income immigrant workers. Thrilled that he decided to enter politics. The current mayor of Providence, Rhode Island, Angel Taveras, who is that city's first Latino mayor, just actually announced his candidacy for governor. It was interesting, when he was an Echoing Green fellow, after graduating from Harvard College, he went back to the same housing project in which he had grown up with his single mom and his siblings, and started an after-school program. The program didn't really get off the ground, and Angel went off and went back to law school, became a housing judge, went back to Providence and had a terrific career, and then entered politics. And it was very interesting. A couple years ago, he actually won the top prize of Mayor Bloomberg's, his $5 million prize for good ideas to transform your city, based on the idea he had had as an Echoing Green fellow 20 years ago. So I think there's something very powerful about having an experience working deeply within a community and then translating that experience into later work. So I think it will happen, but I actually think there's some structural fixes that we all should think about. As I mentioned, about 81% of young people are really committed to being change agents. They want to give back, but when you look at the number of young people who then go into government service, it's something like 6%. And part of it is that there are no clear pathways for them to get into doing this work. I think Teach for America is a great example of how, if you can build recruiting mechanisms and onboarding mechanisms to getting these young people into these public service careers, then we actually could build pipelines that are sustainable over time. So I actually think there's some structural barriers that, if we focused on giving kids like Jack and young people like Jared clear roadmaps for how to go down these pathways, then I think you'd get a lot more young people gladly willing to serve and to devote their careers to doing this kind of work.
Interesting. Jack, I'm very curious. You've thought about a lot of things in life already, but I'm not sure how much you've thought about your own generation. I'm just curious, what do you think the leadership potential is of you and your peers as you look ahead?
So I think that incorporating youth into the leadership process and decision-making process is really essential because in a post-2015 agenda, youth are going to play a critical role. I mean, just under the age of 20, we make up over half the world's population. And to disregard us as more, we need to become more than just an interest group that can influence policy. We need to start being able to make the decisions, because a lot of the issues that youth face are often ignored, and we're the ones that are going to inherit a world of multi-resistant tuberculosis and climate change. And so making youth have a greater role in decision-making process is really instrumental. But secondly, youth are this epitome of both creativity and intelligence, where we have enough creativity to come up with these crazy off-the-wall ideas, but enough knowledge to really make them come to life. And I think that will play a really significant role in future decision-making processes.
You have thought about that. Do you, if you look then at the promise of the Arab Spring, and then sort of how things have gone off track in a number of countries, are there any lessons you learned from that, draw from that?
Ooh.
I mean, that was a youth-led revolution.
Yeah, it's a bit outside of my field, but
I don't notice it very much as outside your field. You've got a pretty wide bandwidth.
But I would think that I'm not really too well-read on that event, but I don't know the answer to that.
That's a fair. That's a very permissible answer at 17. It's okay. But Jared, what about you? You've thought about this a lot.
Yeah, and I've been traveling to the Middle East and North Africa for a long time. I was in Egypt the day the revolution happened, and subsequently have been back to Libya, Tunisia. I was just in Lebanon and the Syrian border about a week and a half ago. And when you look at what's happened in the last 3 years, I think that there's a lot of euphoria in the early days of the Arab Spring around leaderless revolutions, and everybody's coming together and they're getting out these autocrats who've been in power for multiple decades. And I think that the real conclusion that one can draw from the Arab Spring, or whatever we're calling it these days, is that in the future, really even in the present, we're seeing that revolutions are easier to start and happening faster, but they're harder to finish. And the reason I say they're easier to start and happen faster is the obvious, that technology allows people to organize in virtual town squares as well as physical town squares, and it's very easy for leaderless movements to band together around the lowest common denominator of, we don't like this bad dictator who's been running our country, let's get him out of power. Now the problem is that's the only thing that anybody agrees on. And so once the dictator's out of power, what you're left with is a vacuum, no institutions, no civil society, and no leaders with new last names who have a vision for the country and can be part of a constitutional drafting process that can actually deliver basic goods and social services better than the autocrats who are in power. And so it's interesting, when I go back to Iraq now, or when I go back to different parts of the Gulf and the Maghreb, it's startling to hear people say, you know what, we didn't like Saddam Hussein, but we could go to the market without something being blown. I mean, imagine that. We didn't like Mubarak, but all these years we thought we wanted to speak freely. What we really wanted was our safety and security. And I think that in the US, where we have security and rule of law, and in many respects take it for granted, we assume that in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, everybody's first step is civil liberties. In reality, when you talk to people, everybody's first step in this pyramid is security, safety, and rule of law. And that's really what's evaporated. I think the other reason I say that revolutions are harder to finish is really two other reasons. One, I think technology raises expectations. So people expect change to happen under a new regime as fast as they were able to get into the streets and get these dictators out of power. The second, and this is somewhat contradictory to the optimistic theme of leadership that is tonight, I do believe that in these environments that don't have a history of institutions or civil society, that the accelerated pace of movement making may in fact retard leadership development. And I think that's what you are seeing in the Middle East, that people are becoming celebrities before they're becoming leaders. And you think about the Mandelas, the Lech Walesas, the de Gaulles of the world, it took them decades to emerge as leaders with the skills that ultimately led them to emerge as public figures, and we've now reversed the order. And so where does this leave us? It may be that we'll go back through YouTube footage, go back through the tapes, and we'll figure out which celebrities we want to backfill with leadership skills.
Yeah. That's an interesting idea. Tony Blair argues, in fact, that the modern politics and technology to a considerable degree encourages certain kinds of skills to get into office. You have to be very good oratorically. You have to give a lot of public presentations. You've got to have a certain amount of charisma. You've got to have the kind of messaging. But when he became prime minister, what he realized were those skills were not the skills he needed to govern, not to be an executive. He wasn't accustomed to making decisions. He certainly wasn't accustomed to working with bureaucracies and making sure they executed the decisions as he wished. And he actually felt that it wasn't until his second term that he really learned how to be a very good chief executive. But it took a while to do that. But it reflects on this whole question is that to get there now, you've got to create this sort of celebrity narrative.
And you need institutions, right? I mean,
Yeah.
this is the fundamental problem in these environments, right? As much as we don't like autocrats, autocrats when they've been in power in these countries for 30, 40 years, the one thing they were good at is providing security by virtue of being autocrats. And so then that came unraveled, and there was really nothing to fill the vacuum. And I think that's really the fundamental problem going forward. I don't think there's an easy fix to this. I think Tunisia is probably the only post-Arab Spring country that you could argue is going reasonably well, although not without its challenges. It's going to be a 10+ year process for these countries to build institutions essentially from scratch.
Good, terrific. Now we're getting questions from the floor, and one that I think expresses a common theme. You all can each say this to yourself. Can we invite the speakers to other community events? How? How would if someone wanted to send you an invitation quickly, Jack? How do they reach you?
Twitter @Jack Andraka, or you can just email me, jackandraka@gmail.com.
Jack Andraka @email.com. Cheryl.
Sure. We have an amazing community of social entrepreneurs. We love to put these young people in front of folks like you, and you can reach me at cheryl@echoinggreen.org.
Okay, and Jared?
I would not try to call the main line at Google. Typically, it does not work.
You all have a telephone at Google?
Yeah, there's one somewhere. The best way, you can just tweet at me at Jared Cohen.
Okay, terrific. Cheryl, where are we going to find more women leaders?
Yeah, I know, that's right. It's such an interesting phenomenon. 20+ years ago, I was an Echoing Green Fellow. So I got my start when I was in graduate school, had started studying the issue of Black infant mortality in inner city Boston, and working with another woman physician, started a mobile health unit to work on the disparity between health outcomes in that city. And at the time, when I became an Echoing Green Fellow, there was gender equity in my class of Echoing Green Fellows. And for many years, one of the things Echoing Green was proud of was we were probably the most diverse fellowship community amongst social entrepreneurs working around the world today. But in the past couple of years, we've noticed an increasing gender imbalance in terms of the fellows that we're funding. More than 60% are now men each year. And it's something that we've talked to other social entrepreneurship fellowships about because it's a phenomenon that seems to be common amongst all of us. And I think part of it is sort of this startup culture. Which the way that it messages itself, the competition, the Silicon Valley startup male stance has really sort of trickled down into the social entrepreneurship world, and it's tough. But I will say that they're out there. Young women, people of color, many of whom actually don't yet self-identify as social entrepreneurs. They know that they're community change agents. They know they're working proactively to make their communities better. So in part, it's sort of a branding and messaging job on our part to do a better job of reaching those young people who are already acting and walking through the world as social entrepreneurs, but don't identify as such yet. So I think the onus is on us as funders to do a better job to do the kind of outreach and build the pipelines into the field, because we desperately need that diversity.
Jared, we hear a lot about Sheryl Sandberg. She has 33,000 Lean-In chapters now, I think, around the world. Yahoo with a new CEO, but there are not that many women in technology, are there?
I think that hopefully it's starting to change, and I think the first step is people talking about this. And Cheryl's fantastic and has really elevated the conversation. Marissa has elevated the conversation. But I think everybody has a role in this. You know, it's funny, two of my three bosses have been wonderful women. You know, Condoleezza Rice and Hillary Clinton. So I really only know working for women. So but now I'm in the technology sector. It's a very different story. I think, you know, the industry recognizes that this is an issue, but I think the good news is everybody's taking it very seriously. And the other good news is I always find that when I work with women, they're typically the smartest. So we're in good shape for the future.
Okay. Jared, the question has arisen, do you think Hillary Clinton would be a good president?
I think she'd be a fantastic president.
Tell us more about that.
I think that, my experience with her was on the foreign policy side, and I, for one, don't think foreign policy should be partisan one way or the other, except tends to get partisan around the narrow issue of free trade. And I think that, you know, Secretary Clinton, is, to me, one of the most committed people that I've ever come into contact with. You look at the miles that she logged as Secretary of State, and she'd go to every single country and she'd sit with, you know, women of those countries, and she'd sit and listen to them and the issues and challenges they were facing. And I remember, I'll tell you one story that really illustrates that this wasn't just for show. I remember she went on vacation, and she spent her entire vacation emailing back to all of us about these Iraqi war widows that she'd met in Iraq. And she didn't understand why we weren't doing more to help Iraqi war widows. And she was on vacation. She really needed a vacation. But this conversation that she had stuck with her so much that she literally just kept talking about it until the bureaucracy moved and started doing more to help these women. I think she'd be fantastic for American foreign policy. I think after 4 years of Secretary of State, it's, you know, hard to imagine, somebody who has a better understanding of the world, and I think she'd be fantastic. There's a lot of great candidates, prospective candidates that are out there, and, you know, I assume she'll be one of them. And if she is, if she won, she'd be fantastic.
Terrific. Jack, the question's for you. Are you feeling positive about your peers wanting to make the world a better place, or are you disheartened?
So I feel actually really optimistic about my generation. I mean, just at the Intel International Science and Engineering Festival or Fair, there are over 1,600 students there, and the projects are at least graduate level, and there are 1,500 of them. And so I feel pretty confident that we have the ability to make a significant change, and that's just in the science. I don't know too much about other things, but it's pretty amazing.
Terrific. A second question to you, on going back to your original, your work. Is it possible to commercialize the test for ovarian cancer earlier, given its higher incidence?
So we are looking at that. So right now I'm still in talks with those different biotech companies. One of the major hurdles that's really keeping us from doing these large-scale clinical trials is this one Supreme Court hearing that essentially ruled that cancer samples belong to institutions and not to doctors. And so that means when you want to do cross-institutional work, especially with commercializing a test, you actually have to buy samples from institutions, and those can run up to about $5,000 per sample. And when you need to do 25,000 samples, that quickly adds up into the multi-millions.
Wow. But the money, I mean, if you could save that many lives, surely the money can be found.
Yeah, so money can be found, but you still need to buy the samples and get them transported to different areas. It's a really gigantic logistical problem just transporting the samples and doing all the tests, because 5-minute increments add up pretty quickly. And right now it's me doing the tests and no one else, and I have high school as well and homework.
Jared, a question we asked about your observations about corporate America more generally. How seriously does it take its social responsibilities these days?
I mean, I think if you look at the trajectory of companies, right, companies are doing more philanthropy, they're doing more corporate social responsibility. I think there's another dimension of this, which is something that I've tried to focus a lot on at Google, which is you think about how companies do work internationally. typically falls in one of three categories. It's core business, it's philanthropy or corporate social responsibility, and it's public policy or government relations. But especially as somebody who now works in the technology sector, who has a geopolitical background, there's a whole bunch of issues and challenges that the industry is going to inherit by virtue of all these people coming online that don't fall neatly in any of those three categories. And so, there's the way that I think about this from the tech sector is there's technology for good, which can be, have a nexus with the core business. It can have a nexus with the philanthropic arm, but there is also this nexus between all these international security issues that are only going to become more and more relevant over time that companies can't ignore. And in some cases, companies will build products that produce a lot of revenue that help address these challenges. In some cases, they'll deliberately lose a lot of money in the process of tackling some of these challenges. But the reality is companies are no longer able to avoid being caught in the crossfire of geopolitics. And that's particularly the case for a technology company. And so if companies are being thrown in the middle of all these geopolitical dynamics, you basically are left with two options. You can be reactive about it and sort of hope it all goes away, but that's not a very good probability. Or you can recognize that this is the new world in which we live in and proactively as a company think about how you embrace all this change, how you mitigate the risks that come with it. In the case of a technology company, we think about users. So when I think about Google Ideas, we focus on a particular category of user that's out there that's having a really difficult time, right? These are the people who live in North Korea, who live in Iran, who live in very censored environments, whose numbers today might seem quite small and just a fraction of the overall internet population, but who, if we do nothing to change the direction we're headed in, are going to represent the largest number of people who are using the internet. And that affects all of us, right? We enjoy a free and open internet. Do we want the internet ecosystem that we enjoy so much today to be dominated by states and environments that don't believe people should have access to information?
Jared will be here to sign a copy of his book out here when it's over, the book that he wrote with Eric Schmidt on the new digital age. He'll cover many of these subjects. I was curious, Jared, how you felt about, there was a story in the Times, and you've, I'm sure, talked about it with your peers a lot, in San Francisco, where the income inequality is expressing itself now by resentment shown toward techies who are in Google buses or other buses. They're being driven down to their places of work in Silicon Alley from the city, and a lot of people are coming out to protest, in effect, against income inequality, and what they see is the new elite. And they're really worried that jobs are going to disappear as a result, say, of driverless cars. How many taxi cab drivers are going to lose their jobs with driverless cars, which Google is building? So what is the corporate responsibility here, and how do you think about this income inequality issue?
Well, of course, in New York, we experienced something similar with Occupy Wall Street, several years ago. So I think different cities have experienced this in different ways. But I think, I don't know that you would point to any one sector and say they have the sole responsibility to think about this. I think when people are frustrated about income inequality and when unemployment is spiking, when the economy is tanking, obviously that's of great concern to all of us, and it's a shared responsibility. Companies have a role to play, the government has a role to play, individual citizens have a role to play, educational institutions have a role to play. I can go on and on and on. And I think all of us have a responsibility to understand what the root cause of all of this is, right? There's lots of ways that it manifests itself, but if we really want to fix the problem, we need to look at the root causes. And I think we need to resist the urge for sectors to try to troubleshoot this on their own. There's no one sector that has all the tools and expertise at their disposal.
But when all this money is moving into executives and these tech startups that have been successful, and other people are left behind, is that just that's capitalism as it should be, or is there something we should address?
Well, I think I think that it's certainly something that we should be talking about, but I also think we shouldn't take it out on innovation, right? We don't want we don't want the country to stop innovating because we're worried that the next great company will put people out of work. People aren't being put out of work because this company pops up or that company's popping up. People are being put out of work because we're not training people with skill sets that are needed for a new century. And so, again, we all have a shared responsibility to play, but I don't think anyone wants the country to stop innovating. I don't think anybody wants companies to stop innovating. That's one of America's great advantages in the world. It's one of our success stories in a world where the global economy is not in great shape.
I hope you're right. I mean, I hope you're right. We don't start penalizing innovators, because that would really be a tragedy. I mean, that's what it was worrisome about this story out of San Francisco. It was like, wow, if we turn on these folks.
But the grievances are very real.
When
People are this upset, it's not about who they're directing their attention at, who's being blamed. When people are this upset, or grievances are manifesting themselves in ways that are so visible, that are apparent to all of us, there needs to be some serious engagement that's happening. And again, that engagement is not between the government and the citizenry. That engagement is far more holistic, and it's cross-sector.
Good. Let's bring this home now. It's 9:10, and we promised we'd get you out of here by 9:15. So I'd like to ask one last question to each of you, starting with Cheryl, then Jared, and then Jack. Okay, so we've been talking about leadership in various kinds of ways here tonight about the younger generation. What do you think are the most important qualities of leadership for the 21st century, for your generation that's coming to flower now? And how does that contrast with what you've seen in the past? Cheryl?
So again, sort of watching the example of many of the young people that we've worked with over the last 25 years, I would say a couple of things. So I do think innovation is a really key part of this. I think the creativity that it unleashes, the economic prosperity that it potentially unleashes, the new way of thinking about community that it unleashes is absolutely critical. On the flip side of that, what I love and what I see increasingly with the social entrepreneurs with whom we work is a real tolerance and acceptance of failure. The issues that they're taking on are so tough. They're incredibly complex, and for every 3 steps forward that they take, they often take 1 or 2 back. So a level of comfort and facility with sort of failing, but getting up and trying again, I think is a really key part of the leadership strategies and tactics for the 21st century. I also think an increasing level of comfort with diversity and navigating different cultures. The world looks very different today than it did when I was coming of age, so being really facile in crossing those sorts of boundaries is really, really important. And I think sort of using the leadership tools of soft power, recognizing that you sort of can't do things in a top-down autocratic fashion as a leader no longer works, but how do you use persuasion, how do you align incentives, how do you build coalitions and alliances to get done what you need to get done. These are some of the things that we see among some of our most successful young leaders, and I think it's promising.
Terrific. Jared?
I'll answer this question, David, with an observation from my time in government, which I remember going to work one day, walking into the State Department, and it dawning on me that foreign policy and statecraft are basically very sophisticated and glossy ways of saying troubleshooting. You think about what foreign policy is, it's basically troubleshooting the world's challenges. And it's interesting, when you think about foreign policy or statecraft and determine that it's really troubleshooting, it totally leads you to reevaluate tactics. And what you realize is the way to troubleshoot something is in pairs with groups, leveraging different types of tools that you have at your disposal. I think if there's one message that I could leave behind, we live in a world where challenges are so multidimensional and no one sector or discipline or experience has all the tools and expertise in-house, that true leaders of the future are going to need to lead in groups. This notion of leaders as individuals will always exist because of the way our societies are structured. But if we're really thinking about leaders who are going to change the world and build, they're always going to have a partner. They're always going to have an entourage. They're always going to have collaborators. And so the leader of the future is more of a co-founder than a founder.
Huh, that's very interesting. I'm curious, I just have to ask this question. If foreign policy is about troubleshooting, where does strategy fit in?
Well, presumably, if you're troubleshooting something, you sit down and talk about how to troubleshoot it,
right.
Plan it out. But I think that it's interesting. I worked in policy planning, which is the arm of the state, is the State Department's, as the Secretary of State's personal think tank, and you're supposed to develop strategy. I now work in a sector where these companies haven't been around very long. So you talk about a 10-year horizon, these companies will say, we haven't even been around for 10 years. And so strategy in the tech sector looks very different than strategy in government in that it's much more short term. But strategy is an aspect of troubleshooting, absolutely. I even remember this as a young boy trying to fix a train set. You sort of sit down and sketch out how you're going to fix it and think it through, and it's much more efficient.
Terrific. That is an obvious segue. Train sets, over to you, Jack. Thinking about this, you have been, just thank you for making a special effort to come today, tonight. But I'm really curious. I think everybody here is curious to learn more from you, your perspective. How do you see the qualities of what's important? You clearly think are headed to be toward a leadership role in your generation.
So what I think is, there are a few traits I think are really important. The first is the ability to work outside your field really effectively and be able to listen to your peers. And so, for example, with my research, a lot of times I'm atrocious at physics and chemistry. And my brother, on the other hand, is amazing. And so I always will go to him to ask him a question. And that's how I get around a lot of the problems I don't know about. And then also, I think, is the ability to communicate your ideas very effectively. Because one interesting story was with the invention of the television, this guy came up with it at Siemens Westinghouse, and in the meeting, he actually got fired because of it and was told he was crazy. And then he went to a different company, formed it, and was able to become a very successful person. And you wonder what was the difference that made it in that Siemens meeting, and his inability to communicate his ideas effectively were a major barrier between his idea and realization of it. And so I think effectively communicating your idea to the masses is very important, because if you don't communicate your ideas very well, then it's just an idea and no one's going to be able to get behind it. And so I think that would be one of the most important traits, is being able to communicate it.
Sure. Well, we at the Center for Public Leadership at the Kennedy School are privileged to join with the 92nd Street Y in bringing to you a series of 3 programs. The next one will be with Larry Summers. And as you heard, after a short time after that, we will have a session with General McChrystal, Stanley McChrystal, General Dana Bourne, who was the first woman to win flag rank at a military academy, and the police commissioner here in New York, Bill Bratton. All of them will be there here to talk about leadership from a different perspective. But in the meantime, and we welcome you back, in the meantime, I think we've had a thrilling evening tonight. We owe an enormous amount to these 3. Thank you. And I hope that we will all leave here tonight encouraged about the future because of folks like this and what they represent. And they're the leaders of their generation. But from my perspective, they give us great hope about America. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you.